Hello and welcome back to MEE Live. I'm Matilda Mallinson. It's Tuesday the 13th of January and our first show of 2026. Since we wrapped over the Christmas period, simmering tensions between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have exploded into public view as the former allies in the war against Yemen's Houthi forces turned on each other in the country's south. And Donald Trump's administration in the US has bombed Venezuela, abducted its president, and hinted Cuba or Colombia or Greenland could be next. It's a power and natural resources grab that rips up the rulebook of international propriety. But if 2026 will mark a new world order, there's another country whose events we cannot ignore. Iran is seeing an eruption of domestic tensions that is threatening to draw in international involvement. If it succeeds in its chance of toppling the regime, its consequences will spill far beyond the Middle East. Today, the counter-revolution in Iran. 47 years ago, Iran had a revolution that replaced a US-allied monarchy with an anti-Western theocracy. Today, it may be on the verge of a counter-revolution. The deadly protests now unfolding across the country began on the 28th of December when Iran's currency, the rial, plunged to 1.48 million to the dollar. In 1979, it was 70 to the dollar. Merchants poured out of Tehran's central bazaar, soon joined in the streets by ordinary Iranians watching their purchasing power plummet by the hour. This coincided with an extreme water crisis caused not only by drought, but chronic mismanagement of civil infrastructure that symbolises, to many in Iran, the incompetence of a theocratic regime that has long rewarded ideological loyalty over skill. The water crisis has also been blamed on a water mafia linked to the country's military, a military from which much of the nation's wealth and power flows. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is deeply unpopular among the country's 90 million people, yet their strength has so far protected the regime. By contrast, last year's devastating 12-day war in which the US and Israel pummeled nuclear facilities in Iran, killing dozens of civilians and hospitalizing thousands, this called into question the regime's military strength overseas. So economic, political and security concerns, underpinned by deep-rooted cultural anger towards a regime that violently polices its people's freedoms, combined to bring Iranians from all corners onto the streets. Within a week, the demonstrations spread to all 31 provinces, and the demands changed from economic relief to the end of the Islamic Republic. The government's response has intensified in turn. After initially attempting to appease protesters with subsidies, it has now cracked down with force. Violent censorship, a ban on most international reporters, and a government-imposed internet blackout make it hard to ascertain the true numbers dead or detained. The UN says hundreds. At least one government official from Iran has put the death toll in the thousands. But this is not the first time the regime has faced mass protests. Iranians have marched repeatedly in past decades against an authoritarian government that has not faltered. But as far as we can tell, these are the largest and most threatening protests yet. Will these be the ones that topple the regime? Are there alternatives in place for a smooth transition of power, or could regime collapse lead to further devastation? And will those marching for their rights in Iran be sincerely assisted by the international community or hurt by foreign agendas? Today we'll speak to political scientist Vali Nasr about the political forces in play inside Iran, and then to Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute about the question of foreign intervention. But first, I'm joined by Iranian human rights activist Hoda Katebi to assess the latest news coming in from the ground. Hi, Hoda. So aerial and user-generated footage from Iran, it's showed hundreds of nationwide protests, but obviously information is very hard to verify, deliberately so. The internet blackout continues, but some Iranians have been able to make phone calls. Have you spoken to anyone in the country recently? And what have you learned about the latest situation on the ground?
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't had any communication with friends or family, or heard from the usual sort of people who I follow and go to for statements and positions from various collectives and worker organizations in Iran since Thursday night. So this has been a very serious blackout that I think has very intentionally so kind of disconnected us from what's happening on the ground in Iran, which I think can only lead one to speculate as to the devastating consequences of what's happening right now.
Did you get a sense when you did speak to your friends and relatives whether morale is sustaining amid the crackdown or whether stamina is faltering?
I think that's a great question. Day by day, I think every day looks different. I think at this point also, it's important to note that many areas of Iran that have been seeing sustained protests are more working class areas, more communities or areas that have a majority of ethnic minorities. And a lot of the statements that have been coming out from these areas are just that people have nothing else to do but to die, and they are willing to die to fight to get out of poverty, willing to die to fight to experience a life of that has a future and has possibilities and hope for what could come next. And I think that unfortunately the economic situation in Iran has just become so dire and obviously tied to political and social conditions that people are willing to, for the first time, I think, come out in mass and are willing to die for change.
Of course, the narrative coming from the Iranian government is quite different. They have claimed that the protests are largely under control. They've broadcast footage of pro-government rallies on state TV. Are the pictures we're seeing of pro-government demonstrations convincing to you? And how strong is popular sentiment in favour of the regime?
Sure, and that's a great question. Of course, there are people in Iran who support the government, both in diaspora and as well as in Iran. According to last election, a little over 10 million people voted for the current government. Of course, take what you will of official government data sources, but there is a large group of people in Iran who do support the government, and that is something that we have to grapple with. Now, is the system under control? Does this represent the larger 90 million people in Iran? Absolutely not. And I think that speaks to how widespread these protests are, and seeing what types of people, the diversity of types of people who have come out, how large these protests are across Iran. And I think that there's a very real anger and a very real desperation that is really coming to a sort of head in this moment. Is this enough to sustain a sort of revolutionary momentum to actually cause a shift in the system in Iran? Time will tell. There are specific institutions that still haven't defected or turned and offered their support to the Iranian people. So the jury's out on that end. But I think it's very clear that many people, millions and tens of millions of people in Iran, are saying enough is enough.
You've painted a very clear picture of the desperation and the poverty that underlies a lot of the frustration here. This is all happening in the context, of course, of suffocating sanctions on Iran imposed by US President Donald Trump. Hoda, you've posted some really interesting points about sanctions and how they're being discussed. Sweeping sanctions are designed to pressure a government by manufacturing economic hardship, often, to fuel this kind of unrest. And so cynically, what that essentially looks like is starving people into revolution. Is helping mobilize this protest something that the US and Donald Trump can take credit for?
I think that's a very interesting question. There is no doubt that sanctions have a major role to play in the economic catastrophe that is the Iran's financial state right now. And just recently, many of the UN snapback sanctions after Trump withdrew from the JCPOA have also gone into effect, that have also impacted inflation and impacted the value of the Iranian rial, which has led to the moment of uprising in December. So there are obviously many external factors. There's already been external intervention in Iran that has caused this level of poverty and disenfranchisement in a large part. At the same time, people also recognize that there is mass corruption in Iran. There are people who have extreme wealth in Iran, and people are left with questions and they're left with anger. And there is a disparity that has worsened and domestically in the country. A lot of this is tied directly to sanctions as well as government mismanagement.
But is that the same as sanctions?
Have actually strengthened the Iranian government.
No, I was going to just say exactly. Is that the same as sanctions helping the people of Iran in this protest movement?
Sanctions have absolutely not helped the people of Iran. If anything, they've strengthened the Iranian government at the expense of everyday people in Iran. For example, right now, the telecommunications blackout that we're seeing, that's really only possible because the United States has sanctioned Iran to the point of isolation that allows the Iranian government to monopolize telecommunications to turn it off with a switch. So sanctions have allowed the sort of isolationist policies within Iran that strengthen the Iranian government, allows and feeds the corruption that we're seeing, allows and greatly sort of makes these class distinctions even more stark. And because of that, that is one of the major factors that are leading to these current economic protests. So yes, absolutely, sanctions have their role. And as those of us outside of the United States have our obligation in getting the United States to end its intervention in Iran. And also there are very real grievances of people in Iran economically, socially, politically that have come to end and didn't have to exist this way. And I think people are very righteously angry and are asking for the end and are asking for something better and are demanding that they get to have a life without poverty.
There are a lot of external attempts to characterize this movement, as well as the sort of sanctions narrative. For example, protests for Iran, in solidarity with the protests of Iran here in the UK. They've hosted far-right Islamophobic pundit Tommy Robinson. Israeli flags have been waved. J.K. Rowling tweeted that these marches are a rejection of Islam. It's always often being framed in these wider geopolitical narratives or the clash of civilizations. And I'm interested in whether you think there's truth in that, but perhaps the bigger question is how important it is to separate these external agendas from the very diverse agendas of Iranian people who are taking to the streets.
Sure. Well, you can never separate geopolitical concerns with anything that's happening domestically anywhere in the world. Of course, what the United States and Israel have been saying during these protests, that there are Mossad in the streets, of course, that has an impact. That has an impact in many ways. One of that is that the Iranian government gets to use that as cover to then massacre people in the streets, because if there are Mossad agents in the streets, then we have every right to kill them. This only feeds the ability of the Iranian government to crack down on people in the streets. We can't say that any protest is devoid and happens in a vacuum and has no impact to or is not impacted by foreign intervention. At the same time, that doesn't mean that the people and the demands of the people on the ground are not real, are not valid, and deserve to be heard. And I think that we have to be able to trust that the people of Iran have overthrown many rulers and have changed and asked for many types of government over hundreds of years. And I think that we can only hope that the widespread protests right now, that many of them are demanding no current government, no foreign intervention, no Shah, can also continue to withstand all of these horrendous attempts at foreign intervention that are only going to make the experiences of Iranians in Iran even worse. And so both can be true, both are true. And every protest has happened in a time that it is inconvenient, but that doesn't delegitimize the very real grievances that are pushing people into the streets today.
Hoda Katebi, thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Thank you for having me.
So can Iranian protesters succeed in toppling the regime? And if they do, what next? Some protesters have rallied behind former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi as an alternative. He has lived in exile since the 1979 revolution.
خیابان‌ها را رها نکنید. قلب و روحم با شماست و می‌دانم که به زودی در کنار شما خواهم بود.
But others oppose a return to the monarchy that historically was seen as repressive, corrupt and subservient to foreign powers. And even Pahlavi's supporters are disunited in what kind of order should replace the theocracy. Here now to take us through the political forces shaping Iran and the potential political futures facing Iran is Iranian-American political scientist Vali Nasr. Vali, welcome to Middle East Eye. Tell us, what is driving this movement? It began with fiscal crisis. We've seen women life freedom slogans being chanted. There's workers, families of political prisoners, Kurdish groups. What unifies them in their opposition?
Well, the protest really started about economic issues, and there is an enormous amount of economic pain across the spectrum in Iran that ties all segments of society together. Iran's economy is ravaged by inflation, by unemployment that have been aggravated by maximum pressure sanctions. Between December of last year, that's 2024, and December 2025, Iran's currency lost about 84% of its value, and inflation on food spiked by about 72%. So except for a segment of super rich Iranians, the rest of society is in one way or the other hurting from what's happening. And they are obviously reacting to it very differently. But they want their government to address it by dealing with mismanagement, dealing with corruption, but also find a way to remove sanctions on Iran. And the government has not been able to do that. In fact, the effort at trying to raise sanctions through negotiations with President Trump ended up instead in a war with no negotiations following the war. And so there is a lot of pent-up anger that came out, but then there's also a broader anti-regime sentiment in Iran. After all, the revolution's been there for about 47 years. You have a generation that is all born after the revolution. They don't remember the years before. They don't remember the revolutionary struggle. The country's tired with revolution, with isolation, and Iranians are imagining in one way or the other, whether democratically or following a strong man, a very different kind of a future. And all of this sort of comes out in form of protests. It starts with a very specific issue like the depreciation of the currency, but very quickly it expands to reflect a much more deep-seated frustration, despondency, and anger of the public.
If these protesters are unified in being anti-regime, what does that mean if the regime falls? Is there any unity in the idea of what should follow? Do Iranians, and I'm sorry for the generalist language, of course there are over 90 million Iranians, but for example, do people want to see the return of the Shah?
Well, there is a lot of nostalgia about the Pahlavi period, largely because in the rear view mirror, given where Iranians are right now, it looks like a golden period to many of them. They look at the Shah or his father's era as a great period. A lot of Iranians travel to the Gulf or to Azerbaijan, where you have dictatorial regimes that are perhaps even more repressive than the Shah was, and yet there is affluence and the kinds of things that some Iranians, particularly in the middle classes, are yearning for. And so there is that element there. And in a way, also being pro-monarchy is a way of rejecting the Islamic Republic, because the Islamic Republic itself set the monarchy before it as the foil. And therefore, this is a way that it's being reflected. And also, there's been a lot of concerted effort since several years ago through exile television channels supported by Saudi Arabia, by Israel, etc., of promoting the monarchy as a solution to Iran's problems, as a way forward. But I think, largely speaking, it's not a question of what Iranians want. Iranians generally want something different, something better. No more economic sanctions, economic prosperity, being able to travel, not being isolated. They want those things. They want law and order. Also, they want morality. They don't want morality police telling them what to wear, what not to wear. They don't want an Islamic government treating them sometimes like an occupied population, for instance. All of these are there. But the reality is that crowds don't make governments. Crowds are very good at expressing anger and bringing down governments. What's lacking in Iran right now is actually an organized opposition and a very identifiable opposition leader. The Islamic Republic has not allowed that to emerge. Every time you've had a civil society leader or a former government leader, like the leader of the Green Movement, in 2009 Mir Hossein Mousavi, or a very prominent intellectual politician, Mustafa Tajzadeh, who's in jail. Every time they emerge, they are basically arrested, put under house arrest, or put in jail. Civil society movements, social movements are dispersed. Inside Iran, you don't have any movement around which people could rally, vote for, congregate, listen to. So as a result, they latch onto these exile figures, most of whom are not really political leaders. They're largely influencers. In other words, they're able to influence and sway public opinion using social media and through these exile television networks and social media. But they don't have a ground game in Iran. They don't have organization. They don't have people. They don't have capabilities that way. And so there is no real political alternative to the Islamic Republic. It's unfortunate to say that, but you and I cannot point to a leader. And the fact that people are talking about Reza Pahlavi, who hasn't been in Iran for 47 years, who does not have a representation in Iran. There's no political organization that represents him. And he communicates through his followers via internet. And if you shut down the internet, he can't communicate with them anymore. The fact that he's emerging as a leader, we're talking about it, exactly tells you about the vacuum of leadership, leadership there. And in fact,
but then I have to ask, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to ask you to answer this as concisely as possible due to time. But you have written in published analysis that Iran's revolution is now nearing its end, that you think this could be the movement that topples the regime. But if you do not see a viable alternative for what comes after, does that mean that there is a risk of chaos, of civil war, of the fracturing of the state in Iran's near future?
Well, if the regime were to collapse, yes, because there's no alternative to it. But what we have in Iran is not a movement, it's an uprising. And the uprising really indicates to you that the people are no longer sold on this revolution. They no longer subscribe to it. So either this state collapses, which I also don't see happening, or this state has to evolve. And obviously the surest way that it might collapse is under enormous amount of American pressure and perhaps military strike. We've seen the United States has caused states shatter by economic pressure, especially by military intervention. But Iran is like China at the end of its revolution, Soviet Union at the end of its revolution. This time is past, and this country will evolve. And these protests are indicative that the people want that evolution. And I think sooner or later they can get it if they don't get disrupted.
Vali Nasr, thank you so much for joining us on MEE Live. Arguably, the biggest threat of the protests to the regime lies not in what Iranians can achieve on their own, but in whether the protests will trigger US military action against Iran.
So Iran's in big trouble. It looks to me that the people are taking over certain cities that nobody thought were really possible just a few weeks ago. We're watching the situation very carefully. I've made the statement very strongly that if they start killing people like they have in the past, we will get involved. We'll be hitting them very hard where it hurts. And that doesn't mean boots on the ground, but it means hitting them very, very hard where it hurts. So we don't want that to happen.
The United States would intervene on behalf of the protesters. President Donald Trump has repeatedly said the United States would intervene on behalf of the protesters, but so far it has not. Today he met his national security team to discuss intervention options. He told the people of Iran afterwards that help is on its way. But what does help look like for Iranians? And do statements like this from a pretty trigger-happy American president do more to help or hurt the movement at a time when the regime is accusing them of being foreign collaborators? Here to explain the indications and the implications of US intervention is Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Welcome, Trita. Now, we are seeing escalating language coming from both the US president and from some members of the Iranian government as well. But Iran's deterrence abroad, it's been pretty diminished with the military disabling of Hezbollah and Hamas, the fall of allies like Bashar al-Assad or Maduro. How devastating would direct confrontation with the US be for Iran's government? And is this something that they can avoid?
I don't think the Iranian government believes that it can win a full-scale military confrontation with the United States. And if they do, I think that's probably rather foolish for them to believe so. But they don't have to win. I think their calculation is simply that all they need to do is to make sure that they destroy Trump's presidency before they lose the war. Meaning that if there is a full-scale war, and this time around the Iranians do respond forcefully, they can, rather than what they have done in the past, which is to strike at empty bases and make sure that there's no US casualties. But if they actually do respond forcefully this time and they end up inflicting a lot of damage on the United States, the confrontation drags on for weeks, that is really sufficient to destroy Trump's presidency and the prospect of his heir to be able to win the next election. And that is, I think, the deterrence that they still have. Trump has shown a willingness to use military force, as you have said, in cases where he thinks that the chances of success are overwhelming, and which he sees a quick, swift action and a very clear path out of the war. He is not particularly inclined to go into messy situations, and rightfully so. And when he has, such as the mistake he committed by going into Yemen, after a couple of weeks, he stopped it and just called it quits, and even said that the Houthis are a tough bunch of nuts. So he is, in that sense, very risk averse. It's just that he has been convinced by Israelis and pro-Israeli elements in the United States that the regime is on the brink of falling. It is extremely weak. And as a result, you can just do a small push and you will then be the hero. You will have caused the collapse of the regime at almost no cost. I think that is a very erroneous assessment of what the situation looks like, but I think that is what has been sold to him. And as a result, he may go down that path with a very skewed risk assessment, very much born out of misinformation, as well as on his own hubris after Venezuela, in which he thinks that this is really easy and that he can do it in many other places.
Well, as you described, Trump's aggression towards Iran has been more verbal than actual military to this stage. There have been statements coming from American officials that aren't shy about implying there is already foreign intervention in play. For example, Mike Pompeo tweeted that Mossad agents were infiltrating the protests. He said, "Happy New Year to every Iranian in the streets, also to every Mossad agent walking beside them." And we've also seen statements like this coming from inside America.
The people are in open revolt. They've chosen not to live this way anymore. And unlike Obama, President Trump has not turned his back on the people of Iran. So I pray and hope that 2026 will be the year that we make Iran great again.
While many Iranians have been calling for the international community to keep their eyes on Iran and to stand in solidarity, the Iranian regime is justifying its repression by blaming foreign intervention and accusing those protesting of being terrorists or collaborators. Does rhetoric like this from American officials do more to help or to harm Iranian protesters?
I think by and large, it makes it much more difficult for the protesters. Now, of course, the Iranian government has accused almost all protests of having been infiltrated by foreign operations and foreign intelligence services. The difference this time around is that you have a foreign country, actually two foreign countries, in which officials or former officials are openly saying that they are deeply involved. You have it on the Israeli side, and which is openly discussed in Israeli media by Israeli officials. And then you, of course, has, as you pointed out, the former head of the CIA, not someone who doesn't know a lot about these things, but someone who's actually was in charge of these things. Now, whether they're saying it as part of a psychological warfare against Iran, or whether they're saying it because it's true, it's of course still not fully established. It could still very well be a psyop from their end. But it nevertheless it makes it much more difficult for people to dismiss the regular accusations that the Iranian government would make that these things have been infiltrated or even are driven by foreign entities.
We heard from our previous interview with Vali Nasr that while this could be the movement that topples the regime, what comes afterwards is very unclear. There isn't necessarily a coherent movement for an alternative, and that could lead to a period of instability, devastating instability even. Do you have any insight into what the US might intend, or whether the US could help to prevent chaos, or whether the US indeed would want chaos in Iran? What is the international idea about what could follow these protests?
So here is where you have a clear divergence, I think, from the US and the Israeli interests. I don't think Trump wants chaos in Iran. We saw that also in Venezuela, in which he preferred to keep the regime in place, but without Maduro, than to hand it over to some opposition figure that the US intelligence said does not have sufficient control over the military, and as a result, there would be instability in the country. Now, of course, Iran is much further away. The US is more insulated from that instability, whereas Venezuela is already producing a large number of refugees that are flooding all of South America, but also Central America, and getting their way into the US, which is a very sensitive topic. But nevertheless, I don't think the US's interest is that. And also the US is somewhat sensitive to the viewpoints of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other countries who absolutely would not like to see any instability. The Israelis are in a very different position. From the Israeli standpoint, they do want to see chaos. They do not want to see any government or any state emerging out of all of this that is strong enough to be able to continue to pose a challenge to Israel's designs for domination. This is openly talked about in Israeli media as well. We just had 2 days ago on Channel 14, which is the channel very close to Netanyahu's government, a gentleman saying that 20 minutes after Assad had boarded the planes to Moscow, the Israelis started turning all of Syria into a shooting range. And that is exactly what they did. This person is not lying. And then he says, after the regime in Iran falls, after, we have to do the same thing in Iran. And then he expresses the wish that he really hopes the US does it as well. So we're talking about military action after the fall of the regime. That tells you something about what the Israeli interest is. I do not think that that is necessarily the interest of the US. I can see the US bombing a lot of military facilities after the regime had fallen. I can see that happening, but not to the point in which it would drive the situation towards complete chaos. That's not because the US is, morally strong or anything. That's not the argument. It's just what is their strategic interest. And I think the strategic interest of the Israelis goes in a much, much different direction.
And what of the interests of the Iranian people? And again, I'm sorry, I have to just, this has to be a quick answer, but I am curious about your thoughts. If foreign intervention could do more to harm than help Iranian protesters, but many Iranian protesters cannot do what they want alone, what foreign policy, what action from the international community do you think is the right course here?
Well, I think it's bottom line is we have to recognize we shouldn't be in this situation in the first place, in which people have become so desperate inside of Iran that they're willing to risk their lives because they don't see any other pathway out. There was no need to be in this situation. We are in this situation because of two factors: because of the repression of the Iranian regime, and because of the sanctions and isolation and war policies of Western states that have driven this country that otherwise is very rich in resources into this degree of poverty in which that desperation has emerged. And then to come say, well, now when that desperate, we don't have any other choice but to go to war. That may have been a legitimate argument if you didn't have a role in driving it towards this desperation. But the West, some of these opposition figures have had a role in that. I'm not putting all of the blame on them. But the manner in which the economy is in the shape that it is very much a factor of the sanctions combined with the regime's own incompetence, mismanagement, and repression. But these two things have fed off of each other and created this terrible situation in which a lot of young people are willing to not only risk violence, but are even asking for foreign military intervention, perhaps because they were not around when Iraq was destroyed, perhaps when they were not around when Syria was destroyed, or when Libya was destroyed, or Afghanistan was destroyed. We shouldn't be in this situation at all. I do think we still can step back from the brink, but I understand that there's a self-fulfilling prophecy here. The worse it gets, the more hawkish, coercive policies seem to be legitimate, even though it is those policies that drove us to this point in the first place.
Trita Parsi, thank you so much for your time. And that is all that we have time for on today's show. But before we lose you, we would love to hear from you. Please send in your thoughts and questions to @MiddleEastEye on any social platform, or email meelive@middleeasteye.net. We'll be here at 5 p.m. in the UK, noon in New York, every Tuesday and Thursday. See you then.